Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today and welcome back to the second installment of our For Purpose Entrepreneurship series. We're your hosts. I'm Casey Van der Stricht, principal at MIT Solve Innovation Future, and I'll let Narges introduce herself.
Thank you, Casey. I'm Narges Baniasadi, co-host of our For Purpose Entrepreneurship series. Happy to be with you guys again.
Yeah. Today, we're continuing our series with two innovators and disruptors from academia and business to share more about why it's important to put purpose at the core of your business. First, we'll start with Shorefast Foundation co-founder Zita Cobb, and then we'll follow up with Professor Colin Mayer. Today, we'll explore why purpose-driven business is good for business, why it's time for fundamental quakes in how we view the role of business in society today, and the practical steps we can take to reframe the role of business in society. I'm really excited for this conversation because for those of you that were able to join us for our introductory event, we hoped that we would focus primarily on why these concepts are important, but that we would pair that conversation with deep academic research and case studies of when this has been done and when it's been done well, so that hopefully we're providing both the research and the how-to. And so will be a really robust conversation today with Colin and with Zita, and we're really looking forward to answering your questions and making you be a part of this conversation. So do feel free to let us know what you'd like to hear more about. Without further ado, I am really excited to welcome Zita Cobb to the conversation. We're so lucky to have Zita join us today. She will share her perspective on the history and developments of corporation and why it's so critical that we've reframed the purpose of business today. Zita, would love to have you, thank you for joining us first and foremost. Would love to just have you introduce yourself and hear a bit more about Shorefast and about the Fogo Island Inn.
Okay, Casey, thank you. Thank you for having me, and Narges, nice to be here with you as well. Okay, I'm going to try and make a 400-year story a little bit less than 400 years. Fogo Island is far away off the northeast coast of Newfoundland, which is the most eastern province of Canada. It's an island. Off the coast of Canada, Fogo Island is an island off the coast of Newfoundland. I think everything is personal ultimately, and it's always a question, where do we start our story? And I think everybody's story starts with place. And that place is really the hero of this story, and I'm going to propose that place should be the hero of all the stories. And so I'm an 8th generation Fogo Islander. The people who settled there came from Devon and Dorset, and some from Ireland, starting in the mid 1600s. They came for cod. We fished for cod for 350 years in tiny little wooden boats that we built ourselves. We had very little contact with the mainland. I feel that I have lived in 3 centuries and I'm not a vampire, because until I was 10, I really lived in the 19th century. And to give you an example, we had no running water, no electricity. My parents couldn't read and write. We had everything we needed, and now it wasn't lovely to have a toothache, so I don't want to romanticize that kind of thing, but it was a very intact community and people lived with dignity. And I will say that my parents would say, and I feel the same, that wealth is dignity. That's how they measured wealth. And let me tell you about the 3 centuries. In the 19th century, we caught enough fish to feed ourselves and a little bit extra to trade with the merchants that came for flour and tea and things we couldn't produce. When I was 10, the industrialization of the fishery started, and enormous ships started to arrive at our shores that just about took every last fish in the ocean. So when I was 10, I witnessed the really near resettlement of our island, the collapse of our community almost, and a complete loss of dignity for people like my father. He was a man who fished all of his life. We didn't actually have cash. There were no banks. So we had a very strange economic system, I suppose. He didn't have a lot of economic logic other than to know how much fish it would take to get this much tea. But he had a deep, deep, deep ecological logic, and he had a very deep social logic. And it takes a lot of social logic to live in a small community. And so when the fish were disappearing, he used to say, who in their right mind would catch all the fish? Like, how does this make any sense? anyway, he died of a broken heart, never really understanding it, but I think he actually did, because before he died, he said, I think they must be turning the fish into money, because that's the only thing he could figure out. And so I studied business because he wanted me to understand. He used to say to me, if you don't understand this money system, it's going to kill us all. So anyway, the island didn't get resettled. We were saved by art, which is a whole other story, because of National Film Board of Canada came, made some beautiful documentaries. If you Google the Fogo process, you'll find this. It's a participatory film process that really activates community in solving their problems and coming together. And so I had a career in business. And so the other century, so the 19th century was before I was 10. The 20th century was what happened when I was 10, with the industrialization of near everything. And my career was in wave division multiplexing. I was a finance person in a company called JDS Uniphase. And I finished early enough to go home. That was a plan. So being of sane mind, I took all the money and I went home and I spent it all to create some economic assets that belong to Fogo Island and belong to Fogo Islanders. And so the reason we held on was because Fogo Islanders back in 1968 started a cooperative at a time where really there were very few fish. They first started with the Fogo Island Improvement Committee, which I think is the most audacious piece of optimism you could ever imagine. And from that, they made a cooperative. That cooperative is over 50 years old now, and it owns the fishery on Fogo Island to this day. And it's one of the most successful fishing enterprises in the entire province. It's owned by the fishers and by the plant workers. So when I went back home working with my two brothers, what we wanted to do was put another leg on the economy, do it in a way that was going to strengthen things we cared about. Because I think that the thing we're trying to always solve for is, what is the relationship between the financial value of something and its inherent value, its intrinsic value? What is the value of a wild caught fish, for example? So we decided, we started by putting the money into a registered charity of Canada called Shorefast. Shorefast is a tether that joins a traditional cod trap to the shore. So it's a metaphor for may we always be shorefast here in this place. And we started a series of social businesses. So there are two arms. There's a for-profit arm and the not-for-profit arm of Shorefast undertakings. We started something called the Fogo Island Inn, which is a 29-room inn that has been chosen as the third best in the world, the best in Canada. So obviously Fogo Islanders are pretty darn good at hospitality, which is what the premise was. We built the inn with local skills and local things and put everything we know about hospitality, love, food, everything. And the inn's become sort of an economic engine to reactivate things that were sleeping that we care about. We have a wood shop that makes furniture and other kinds of furnishings that grew out of the making of the inn. And we have a little fish business that complements the co-op itself. And we bring hand-lined fish to Toronto and sell it to lovely restaurants. And the money, so we target a 15% surplus in those businesses. They operate them as social businesses, which means to us that we operate them with a deep knowledge of and awareness of the relationship between the part and the whole, between what we're doing and how it impacts the whole. We target 15% profit or surplus. We don't always make it. And then that goes back to Shorefast, and we invest that in the not-for-profit initiatives. The biggest one, all of those initiatives really have to do with knowledge. Preserving knowledge through heritage restorations, for example, through boat building knowledge that we had and don't want to lose. Art, the biggest program is something called Fogo Island Arts, which is a residency-based contemporary art program. International artists come, all kinds of artists come from everywhere. And we publish as well from our art program. And we have a geologist in residence program, all to do with knowledge, really. And so it's supposed to form a perfect circle. We think the most important thing is place, because it holds nature and culture. And the hard and tricky part of our work has always been to try and get the governance model right. Because I think the biggest question is, how do we think it matters who owns what, but how do we own things together? And I don't mean that in a way a socialist might think about collective, the central planning and all of that, but how could we own something together? And that's what we've tried to approximate in our Shorefast model, and that's something we continue to try and evolve. And I think that's it.
Just a little bit along the way. And but I think you've actually landed in a really interesting place for this broader discussion of what is the balance of profit and purpose, and how can you think about being someone who's you're looking to generate profit to feed back into this place and to be supportive of community development in that very specific way. But how do you think about that tension of how did you come up with 15 to 20% and why not double, right? As you think about those questions.
I mean, of course, everything is a rhythm of opposites. So I think that accepting that in everything we do is a healthy starting place. And we came up with 15% because, like my father, we needed to have a really good relationship with the idea of enough. And we figured that was enough to achieve what we were trying to achieve in our projects, number one. And number two, to try and drive for more meant we were going to have to pay people less, meant that we were, if we want lettuce, we don't buy it from some big company that delivers it in a truck. We probably have the most expensive lettuce in the world. I mean, Fogo Island's in the North Atlantic. To grow a lettuce is not an inexpensive undertaking, but we're willing to do that because it supports the things we care about. So we didn't think we could I'm not even sure we could, if we tried, get beyond 15% without squeezing something that we don't want to squeeze.
Yeah. Was that a brain shift for you, coming from your previous career and coming back to focus on, where you grew up? How did you balance that, or was there some sort of moment of clarity for you when you said, I'm moving from this very traditional business environment to something that's new and novel and supportive of place?
I would say that in my traditional business career, I had started to become very alarmed about what we were doing. And this constant drive it was a publicly traded company, this constant drive for earnings, and the whole moving of manufacturing all around the world from one place to another, which was hugely disruptive to people's lives everywhere. I think that seeing some of that was what made me realize I need to go home soon, while home is still there.
Yeah. And I guess maybe that's a nice place for us to ask just a little bit more about how do you balance, and this might be a somewhat tricky question, but the fact that you're commercializing home to a certain extent. And do you get questions about that?
Oh, we did this most deliberately, because what we realized was every beautiful place in the world, maybe not everyone, but too many, have been appropriated and instrumentalized by some faraway corporation to make money. And maybe a few trinkets get left behind for the local people. So we decided that we want to instrumentalize ourselves. And these sunsets belong to us. These rocks belong to us together, because Fogo Island is mostly a commons. And so how do we work with those assets? Because we use what's called asset-based community development, a very deliberate way of approaching development, that asks and answers these questions. What do we have? What do we know? What do we love? What do we miss? And what can we do about it? And so when we are driving, because it matters who owns what, we're not going to put our granny out on the corner selling little made far away things. We can create a dignified hospitality experience for ourselves and for our visitors. And so we've done all kinds of things to kind of create that healthy relationship, because I think in the hospitality industry, if you can't get it right there, where are we going to get it right? There's no tipping, for example, at the Fogo Island Inn, because that's not dignified for visitors or for local people.
And thinking about, and this will be my last question before we transition, Narges, if you have questions, feel free to jump in, and then we'll bring Colin in for his part of the conversation. But when you think about how you know if it works, how you know if you've created a dignified environment where you're generating impact for place, how do you know whether or not you've been successful?
The obvious one for any community on the coast of Newfoundland is population itself, because we used to be 6,000 people and now we're 2,500. And so the first sign of success is it stopped dropping. And then enrollment at the school started to go up. So that was the most hugely encouraging thing. But the other things I see happening is people are painting their homes again. And there are, I mean, there are artists everywhere in the world. Our local artists who never thought they could make art to contribute to their income all started
Yeah.
making art because
Yeah.
it's there's a place for it to go. And so I think, and gardens that had grown over are now being replanted. I mean, I think it's the most important thing that you can do for a person or a place is to give it focus.
Mhm.
And I think if people get up in the morning and think nobody cares, this is a lost place, well, then it's going to be a lost place. And so I think the most important thing is just to see the return of things we used to do. It comes with the downside of it is, of course, we have a housing crisis on Fogo Island, which is an insane thing, given what I just told you. We have a housing crisis because when people come from away, they want to buy houses, and their ability to do so is stronger than perhaps local people. So that's something that, you know, we have to figure out, and quickly.
Yeah, that's great.
Great. Thank you. Thank you so much, Zita. So inspiring. You know, I think your story of how you left the fast growth financial business world, saw all these shortcomings, and then went back home and brought that talent and skill to build such socially impactful and meaningful enterprises is so inspiring. And also you touched on such general, like, I think topics of wisdom, such as how part is related to the whole, how the knowledge of whole can help us actually build meaningful businesses, and how place matters, and how good enough is good enough. You know, we don't need to optimize forever. So
Exactly.
very inspiring. Thank you for sharing that. You know, one thing that really stood up for me when I was listening to you is how the whole business trend over the last decade has been towards globalization. So get rid of the notion of space. You know, it is like this virtual world is a small village, and let's just think we're global citizens, so place doesn't matter. And the other trend of automation, that let's just, business means technology and automation versus actually human creativity and art. And we are seeing that, you know, we are seeing the problems it created, both the globalization as well as automation killing jobs, and we don't have many employment opportunities left if we automate all those manual works away. And your story is kind of, okay, you're gonna go against all this, like, you know, movement and trend, and build a meaning in that. So I thought maybe you can speak a few words about it, that how do you see yourself in this kind of business world that is all about globalization, trades, and automation, and making money out of art. You know, how do people perceive that, and how do you see it as a new, maybe reverse trend that is initiating?
Mm-hmm. You know, I am, Nargis, that is exactly the thing I think about every single morning when I wake up, because we're not Luddites, actually. It's not like, and I'm not advocating we go back to the 19th century, even though it maybe sounds like that some days. But I think we, and when I say we in this case, I mean all of us humans, are waking up to some mistakes, and you've called out some of them. We see our work as kind of relocalizing the global. And we sort of organize ourselves around a poem. And it's a poem by a New Zealand poet called The Art of Walking Upright. And one stanza is, the art of walking upright, which is really all about dignity, of course, is the art of using both feet. One is for holding on, and one is for reaching out. And that's what we're trying to do. We think about Fogo Island, we use a cauliflower as a metaphor to say Fogo Island is one little floret in a big cauliflower. And we belong to the cauliflower, and of course we want to. I think some of the best thinkers in this are people who are urban planners, like a fellow named Gil Chin Lim, who said, we have to figure out how to create a global network of intensely local places. And so it's just, we're going to shift how we belong. I think in our work, our questions around where should power reside, and certainly I'm going to advocate for more power residing, and I mean economic power as well, in the local. And I think we can be a globalized, localized world. And I think about technology a lot, because that I came out of, we were manufacturers of little optical bits and pieces that were kind of like the traffic controllers of the internet. And we kept chasing lower and lower price, you know, for for ultimately nothing in the end when I think about it. But and in doing that, we cost a lot of dignity for a lot of people. I'm also a fan of Schumacher's thinking around, technology, yes, but intermediate technology. I mean, technology to the point that it removes senseless labor, but not technology to the point that it throws everybody out of work. I mean, I still can't figure out why we're working on a driverless car.
Mhm.
Why is that a problem? Let's get electric cars, please. But why do they have to be driverless?
We might have much bigger problems to work on, yeah, but
Yeah, yes.
that's where short-term profits reside, I guess.
I guess. So that's obviously the wrong path.
Yeah.
What are we doing?
Yeah. Very good. Thank you so much, Zita. I think that's a good time, a segue to start our conversation with Professor Mayer, talking about these more general global topics and the research Colin is doing on these topics. So welcome to our webinar series on for-purpose leadership and entrepreneurship, Colin. Maybe I do a short introduction. Professor Colin Mayer is joining us today from University of Oxford, Said School of Business, where he's Peter Moore's professor in management studies. Colin is well known for his work on examining and reevaluating the role of corporations in our contemporary society. He's author of many articles about this topic. I encourage you to read about it. And also is an author of the book, Prosperity, Better Business Makes the Greater Good. Colin, thank you again. So maybe we can start by you introduce yourself to our audience and tell us about your story, what happened and why you are working on these topics of purposeful corporations, why it is important, and is it possible for purpose-driven businesses to actually be good businesses in terms of scale and profits?
Narges, thank you very much indeed for that very kind introduction. And what I'm going to do is try and follow up on Zita's really inspiring talk and just give it a little bit of context and background in terms of what's going on around the world in terms of business and the purpose of business, because business is going through a profound change, one of the most profound changes in its history in the current years. And the reason for that is that business has been the source of immense economic prosperity and the growth of nations around the world. But it's also creating increasing problems of environmental degradation, inequality, social exclusion, and mistrust. And underpinning that failure of business is a failure of us to really get the notion of why business exists. What is it there to do? What is its reason for being, which is its purpose? Now, the underlying notion that has driven the behavior of business is a very simple one that was put forward by the Nobel Prize-winning economist Milton Friedman 50 years ago, in which he said that there is one and only one social purpose of business: to increase profits, so long as it stays within the rules of the game. And that has basically driven business ever since, and increasingly so in that direction. And a lot of the issues that Zita has raised really revolve around that preoccupation with one concept of what business is all about. Now, what I argue, and what a number of other people argue, is that that is simply not the right description, and it's increasingly the wrong description, because technology is going to make the problem worse if we just rely on profit maximizing businesses to determine how those technologies are implemented. For example, artificial intelligence offers incredible potential for processing large data sets much faster, much more effectively than any human can do, but anything that we can currently conceive of. But as that happens, and as machine learning and machines begin to learn how to improve their behavior themselves, we move beyond that notion of just helping us to process data in terms of the decisions that we're taking, to actually replacing us in terms of decisions that we're taking. We're talking, you were talking just now, Zita, in terms of the globalization and the effect on jobs, etc. Well, that currently is focused on predominantly manual labor, but where it's really going to make a big difference in the future is in terms of mental labor as well. Because when those machines start taking decisions for us, it raises profound ethical questions about who is programming the algorithms that lie behind them, for what purpose, and are they there simply to make money for someone? And if so, we've got something to be concerned about. So my starting point is to say, if we don't get this right, it's going to get worse. And if we think that we can rely on things like regulation and governments to solve the problem, forget it. Because the speed at which technology is going to change is going to accelerate and leave regulation ever farther behind. So that comes on to, okay, if it's not all about profit, what should it be about? Well, my notion of what a purpose of a business is that it's there to help us solve problems. Fundamental reason for a business existing is to help us solve problems. And it should be helping to solve problems for us as individuals, as societies, and the natural world. And the real challenge of business is, it's not about philanthropy. It's not about charity. It's about hard-nosed business, which needs to make money. And so it has to find ways of solving those problems in profitable fashions, so that it's profitable to invest in, but it's also financially sustainable going forward. And that notion of solving problems in a profitable fashion also raises the question of, well, what's a profit? And there, the second real problem arises, and that is that we are measuring profits in a way that is incorrect, where profit is earned at the expense of other people, at the expense of the planet, in terms of environmental degradation, in terms of employing people in conditions that they shouldn't be working or living in paying people below living wages and precarious jobs and things like that. Those aren't real profits. Those are profits that are essentially wealth transfers from others. And we need to recognize that companies should not be profiting from producing problems for people or planet. Now that's the underpinning then. That business is there to solve problems profitably and not to profit from producing problems. And that then ties it in to the core of a business, its strategy, its values, its mission about what problems it's solving, whose problems it's solving, its vision about where it wants to get to in terms of solving those problems, and why that company is particularly well suited to solving those problems. Now, I want to take an example of a company that I think illustrates this very well. It's the Danish pharmaceutical company Novo Nordisk, which makes insulin that's used in the treatment of type 2 diabetes. A few years ago, Novo Nordisk stated as its purpose that its purpose is to produce insulin. It's descriptive of what it does. It wasn't really a purpose statement as I'm just describing it. It's closer to being a mission statement of what it's actually doing. And then it thought further about its purpose, and it concluded, well, actually, its purpose is or should be to help people treat type 2 diabetes, which might involve them taking insulin, but in many cases did not. So it started working with doctors, hospitals, and universities around the world in terms of identifying the best ways of treating type 2 diabetes. And then it realized, well, actually, its purpose was more than that. It was to help people avoid getting type 2 diabetes in the first place. So it started working with governments, with local authorities, with health workers to identify the changes in lifestyles that might help people avoid getting type 2 diabetes. And its stated purpose now is defeating diabetes. Now, you might say, well, that's all very well, but doesn't it undermine the basic business model if people aren't using insulin to treat type 2 diabetes and are avoiding getting diabetes in the first place? Isn't it killing off its own business? The answer is absolutely not. Its business has thrived on the back of it. Why? Because it's become a trusted supplier of health products and advice around the world in terms of building those relations with doctors, hospitals, governments, and health workers. Now, I think that illustrates 2 points, one of which is the importance of clarity around corporate purpose. And the second is, if you can bring not only clarity, but a real commitment to delivering on a corporate purpose, then it creates the most valuable asset for a company, namely trust of other people. It becomes trustworthy, and it thereby earns that trust that others place in it. Now, what I really want to just end by emphasizing is this is particularly important for people who are starting their businesses. Because if you start a business and you don't have a clear notion of what your purpose is, then you're not going to create a viable business model. At the start of all successful businesses, the founders have a laser sharp notion of what the business is there to do, why it exists, and a real dedication and a sense of mission that that is something that is of real value and benefit to people and planet. And that notion of an underlying purpose should drive the founding and the development of new entrepreneurial businesses. And it's the basis on which that business can then encourage others to participate in working for the company, financing the company, and also contributing as suppliers and those who are helping in distributing and marketing the product. It provides a common objective, a common purpose that inspires people and feels and make them feel motivated in terms of contributing towards it. People want to feel a sense of dignity and pride in what they do. And what a purpose statement and the real enactment of purpose does is to create that common objective that really inspires people to contribute to it. And once you've done that, you're then helping to build the pathway for the business going forward. Then it raises questions about, okay, well, as it scales up, how does it retain that focus on purpose? How can it really become a unicorn, a large-scale company that's maybe listed on stock markets and still keep that notion of purpose with it? And we might come and perhaps discuss that in just a minute. But what I really want to emphasize at this stage is the importance of purpose to the notion of building businesses.
Thank you, Colin. I really appreciate the historical perspective and why we are on this very important point in time that we need to start acting differently as a society. Our audience, of course, as you know, are founders, and especially MIT Solve community and founders who know they want to be purposeful. And they have started their businesses with already having a public service and having a social impact driving their business and decision making. Can you talk about practical aspects of like what needs to happen in our world so that our businesses be purpose driven? Some of it is, of course, outside business world, how it needs to change from policy, culture, values, and all of that, but also just our founders and business community. Because in practical sense, sometimes it is very difficult. Businesses now usually do have a purpose statement or mission statement, but it's very high level and rarely it gets measured or reported on. What everyone is focused on is capital, raising money, getting to profitability. And when you raise money, especially, usually you deal with investors who need to see the return, and usually they are raising money from another investor. So it's really not individual decisions. It's like how the system of investment and capital is designed that is really short-term profit driven today. So what is your practical advice to the entrepreneurs who already are purposeful? How do they go about building their businesses to kind of, in this tension of profit and purpose, make a difference in the world? And especially as startup founders, how can they be leaders of starting this global movement?
Okay, so the first key element is this one that I've been emphasizing about clarity of purpose, having a real precision in terms of what the purpose is, and then a conviction narrative around that purpose that can really convince others of the validity, the importance, the practicality, the commercial viability of that purpose statement, and has a real authenticity associated with it. Okay, so it's not just a presentational material or a marketing campaign. It's something that is a statement of where the company is succeeding, where it's failing, what the problems are in terms of its implementation, so that people can really understand the notion of the purpose as being a living idea that really is embedded in the organization and something that people feel is credible in terms of the way in which it's being presented. So that's the first part, clarity and the way in which it's exemplified and explained and told to others. The second part is to recognize the importance of connectivity, that companies that succeed are ones that build up really good relations with others. I was illustrating that in relation to Novo Nordisk. It could not solve problems about alternative forms of treatment that didn't involve insulin without partnering with doctors and hospitals and universities. It couldn't identify the particular changes in lifestyles that were most relevant in different locations around the world without working with governments and health workers in very local contexts. So finding the right partners to work with and building up the close relationships that create a real understanding of the nature of the problem that's being solved, and not just the problem that the company itself is seeking to solve, but the problems that others in its what is termed ecosystem face in terms of delivering the solutions that the firm is seeking to achieve. So it's a matter of a deep understanding around the communities, the individuals whose problem the company is trying to solve. So in the case of the Novo Nordisk example, it would be a real understanding about, well, what are the nutritional problems that people are facing in terms of their lifestyles, and what practical changes can be made. And I'll give you an illustration of a company, a large American company that was going into India to try and produce more nutritional, cheap foods that would be affordable to people, but were highly nutritious, that were of real benefit to them. And initially it failed completely because it didn't have that depth of understanding of the people with whom it was trying to work and the nature of the problem that its targeted customers faced. For example, it didn't understand in terms of the children who were supposed to be the main beneficiaries of those products, the way in which they were organized in terms of their routines, in terms of eating, and how the company could inject something into that program that was really feasible from the point of view of families that were feeding their children, from the point of view of children when they were at school. And that required a deep, in-depth knowledge of particular localities. And that notion of identifying what are sometimes termed the pain points in the ecosystem is a profoundly important stage in developing a company. It's not a matter of just thinking up ideas in a lab or in a factory. It's a matter of really getting out into the field and working with people who are going to be affected by and potentially the customers of your products. And then there is the stage of, okay, you've built up the partnerships, you've identified the pain points, you really know the nature of the problems and how to address them. How do you then measure performance? How do you incentivize people to really contribute in terms of delivering the right solutions? And those notions of having the right measures are a key component that people are only now just focusing on sufficiently. It's not just in terms of the KPIs, the key performance indicators of the company. It's about how those are related to its profit, to the incentives that it's paying people in the organization, to incentivizing them beyond just profit in terms of really contributing towards solving those problems. It's at that stage when one really links in the notion of solving problems with incentives, with what makes for success of people in the company. That's when they really take this seriously. And that part of embedding it in the organization so that everyone feels a real sense of ownership of that purpose. It's not something that's just the founder thinking up and the board then inheriting from the founder. It's something that everyone in the organization needs to have a real sense of ownership of and a willingness to support it because they believe in it.
Got it. Thank you so much. If I want to summarize it, first of all, I think good businesses are purposeful businesses, the way you're describing a purposeful business. And it starts with a very clear purpose, which has a conviction and authenticity behind it. And then developing the business through partnership and connections to people and all the stakeholders involved in that problem, and eventually actualize it in how you're developing your business in terms of the structures of incentives, financial models, business model, decision making, and so on. Thank you so much for that. So just I'm looking at the time, we don't have much time left, so I pass it to Casey to take us to the next step.
Yeah, Colin, thank you for sharing those frameworks. And I think they're really powerful in terms of identifying kind of first, second, third step along the way to aligning mission and structure. And I'd love to bring Zita back into the conversation, given the fact that she's been living this and living it now for a long time, and maybe allow you two to engage a little bit. I think my first question, based on what I heard from Colin and what Zita's doing on a day-to-day basis, is, Zita, if you were to say to Colin where this might fall down, where has it been hard to integrate the practice that he's describing into the work that you do on a day-to-day basis?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't think Colin and I are going to find much to disagree about. But let me take it. I think a lot of companies start with, and let me speak to my traditional career first. A lot of companies start with founders who have a clear purpose. And things work okay until the founder wants to exit the business is sold. And then what often happens is purpose becomes actually instrumentalized to extract additional financial value and is discarded in favor of short-term profit. I don't know if I have a question this, but let me just carry on for a minute. I think founders need to be more mindful of actually creating the architectures and the processes in their companies to realize the relationships that you're talking about, Colin. I absolutely agree that business should be pro-social. Business should be a web of relationships, not a web of transactions. But that doesn't happen all by itself. We have to be deliberate to call out. For example, if you're running a business in some place, because every business is in some place, what is the relationship between that business and the community it's in? And what have we done as business people to create the architectures that bring together people from our company with people in the community that we're in? I mean, and that's before we get down to, at some point we could talk about social license and community benefit contracts, but I think we have to build it into the fundamental architecture for business, or it will be lost in the tide of time to the push of profit.
You couldn't be more correct, Zita. That is absolutely, well, both those points are the heart of the issue. How do you maintain that focus on purpose as companies grow? Because as you were saying, it's at the stage when they become, in particular, listed on stock markets, that sense of purpose gets lost, or even when they're going through second or third generation of family ownership. And the answer to that point is that some companies structure themselves in a way in which they deliberately embed the purpose. They lock it in. And I'll give you an illustration of that. And it comes from the country where Novo Nordisk is based, Denmark, where there are a large number of what are termed industrial foundations. Those are large companies, some of the largest in the world, like Bertelsmann and Bosch and Carlsberg, that have as their dominant shareholders foundations. And those foundations have the dominant shareholding because the founders, for some reason or other, did not want to pass on those companies to their children. That's because they didn't have them, because they thought that they were no good at running business, or because they didn't like their children. Okay, so for one reason or other, they put them into a foundation. Now, the primary function of those foundations, and indeed Novo Nordisk is owned by a foundation, is to preserve and promote the founder's purpose, to ensure it is perpetuated going forward. So, and these companies are listed on stock markets like Novo Nordisk, actively traded, but those dominant foundation owners ensure the continuity of purpose in those organizations. That's one way in which it's done. Other companies use other mechanisms. Dual class shares are quite common, by which the original participants ensure that the purpose is retained by keeping the control of the company in the hands of a small number of shareholders who primary role is to ensure that the purpose is sustained and retained in the business. Even as it gets listed on the stock market, those shareholders who've got the dominant control of the company can ensure that happens. Okay, so those are two. Now, the other question that you raised is, well, what about global organizations? As companies become big, they lose their sense of place, and that is absolutely right. Headquarters are thousands of miles away from where the company's operations are, or at least some of their company's operations are, and the notion of connectedness within the organization is lost. Now, that is exactly what the most successful global companies avoid. And how do they do it? They do it through a sense of delegation of authority in the organization, so that it is people in the branches, in the subsidiaries, in the local areas who can make decisions, who have a real sense of the purpose embedded in them and the values associated with it, but they are able to make decisions that reflect the local context, where that deep knowledge that I was talking about in terms of building a business is retained through the local authority and devolved control that exists within the organization. And that is the opposite from the way in which so many multinational organizations operate, which is in a
I was going to say, Colin, I don't know one. Can you name one that does that well? Because I can't think of one.
The one that I cite frequently is the Swedish bank Handelsbanken, which is one, if not the most successful banks in Europe, whose mantra is the branch is the bank. And it devolves everything down to the branch manager. And that allows it to build up that element of trust, which I said was so important, between the branch manager and the customers in the locality. It's a relationships form of banking. It's almost like local banking, but in the context of a multinational bank that has devolved decision-taking down to the local level.
What's the pressure then on the leader of the organization? And Zita, are you feeling this at all from a decentralization perspective? What you're really, it seems to me, to be asking is about taking the ego out of the leadership role or out of the centralized or CEO role. And how should entrepreneurs think about that? If you've got the mission and you are driving to make this thing successful, how do you check yourself in terms of, okay, now I'm ready to let go of control, and I'm going to let others, or whether it's local folks or just a decentralized structure, start to do some of that work? Do you run into that at all, Zita?
Yeah, for sure. That, I mean, for sure. And it is about, because people who get up in the morning and think, oh, I'm going to start a company because I think I can do that. They actually think they have at least a part of the answer. And so, and then they become blinded by themselves. And that's why I think it's so important to, in the very early days, build in not just an intention, but a process, a governance process that says, I'm sitting down once a month with this group of people, and I am giving them not just input, I'm actually going to give them power. I'm going to give them votes. I mean, actually, sometimes I think, you know, we should change the rules of companies so that we have people on the board who are representing the people who are dead and gone, and someone on the board who is going to represent people who are not yet born, and they should have a vote. Because I think we become blinded to our own purpose, by our own purpose. And so I think we're missing the connective tissue to participate properly in the communities we exist within.
And if you were to articulate, I guess both of you, the sort of number one piece of these processes and systems that you've articulated, is it about the structure and sort of, I need to be a co-op driven entity, or I need to be a traditional LLC in the US or other? Is it about governance and voting rights, or is it about something else that I haven't articulated that would be the first step? What's the first step?
I think it's both what you said. I think it is structure. I think we need a big think about governance structures. a really big thing. And I really like what Colin was saying about the Danish, and I know some German companies that are owned by foundations, and that has been a really powerful positive force. And that's an example. But I also think we need to be more thoughtful around what do we require as a society of companies that are going to pop up in our community. I think there needs to be they exist as community benefit contracts that you need to sign up to as a company. And no matter who owns that company, you are bound by this contract, and that governs your relationship with the community you are in.
Really interesting.
Yes.
Narges, I know that you had one kind of final question, and we're getting close to time, but I want to make sure that you had a great, like, where should we end this conversation in some of our...
Yes, thank you. I like to ask our guests to give their advice to the business founders who are listening to this webinar, or hopefully podcast as well soon. How can we really catalyze this movement? You know, these are great advice that you had for an individual entrepreneur, you know, how the change starts from ourselves, you know, putting our egos, check them out, and then the governance and architecting our business purpose and all of that. But how can we really catalyze and accelerate this global movement? Because time is short. We are dealing with really big crises all around the world, and we need to change the role of business as soon as possible. So what do you think needs to happen? And what is your advice for the founders to be part of a bigger movement in our world?
Yeah, I think for sure you need to make a really close and deep relationship with your future self. And you when you're dead and gone. And when you are dead and gone, what are people going to say about you? Are they going to say, Casey did this incredible thing that actually changed and deepened relationships between companies and communities and the people they serve. And she did it by X, Y, and Z. And I personally think it's all around governance and around control and thinking about what you're willing to give up as opposed to what you need to hold on to.
Mm-hmm.
And if I could just add to that notion of what you want to achieve in the long term and how you should set about achieving it should be at the forefront of the way in which you think of your business at the start. It's generally a problem that people only begin to confront when they're thinking about a change of control. And that point, and the one that you were making, Casey, about giving up control, and I've been involved in setting up several companies. The hardest moment is when you cede control to someone else in the organization, and having the confidence to do that, and the sense that actually that is important part of the process of growing up. Mm-hmm. But then you have to think in terms of, well, where do you want this company to be in 50 years' time? And the notion of how do you get to that underpins the most successful companies. So, for example, let me come back to the dual class shares that I mentioned. Google, LinkedIn, those are companies that have all used dual class shares. None of them are perfect, but my goodness me, they've been pretty successful businesses. And from the outset, Reid Hoffman, Larry Page, Sergey Brin, they all were clear that they were there to create companies that were going to last. And the key to that was avoiding the stock market influence on the short term. Okay? So they had the vision from the start as to what would be required to retain that success going forward.
Amazing. Well, we are so grateful to both of you for joining us today, and really looking forward to sharing this conversation with solvers and our broader solve community, and hopefully folks that are interested in getting involved in these types of conversations moving forward. So we are deeply grateful for your time, for your willingness to share your story, and for your engagement in the conversation. So thank you so much for joining us today.
It's a very great pleasure. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think we had this 30,000 feet like view of for purpose businesses. And now in the following conversations, we are going to have a deep dive in each of the topics we brought up today, starting on our next webinar about ownership, governance, and legal structure, and going forward. So hopefully we'll not only explain why this needs to happen, but also a lot of practical, detailed knowledge of how founders can implement those changes.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. Have a lovely rest of your day.